A learning and development strategy helps align an organization's business goals with team member needs and skills. But what's the value, and how do you get started?
I think oftentimes we approach the idea of creating a strategy as this easy thing. And the reality is that it takes a lot of iteration, a lot of time, a lot of listening, a lot of conversations. And that's even before you start putting pen to paper. And so really having a very clear mindset and setting clear expectations around what that process is going to look like is probably one of the most important things.
Listen to our guest, Adaora Otiji, Chief Learning Officer at the Washington, D.C. Department of Health, as she provides a guide for creating a learning strategy to drive results. Next on Powered by Learning.
Powered by Learning is brought to you by DaVinci Interactive. DaVinci's approach to learning is grounded in 30 years of innovation and expertise. We use proven strategies and leading technology to develop solutions that empower learners to improve quality and boost performance. Learn more at davinci.com.
Joining us today are DaVinci President Mason Scuderi and our guest, Dr. Adaora Otiji, Chief Learning Officer for the Washington, D.C. Department of Health and the President of the Metro D.C. chapter of ATD. Thank you for joining us, Adaora.
Welcome, Adaora.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here to talk to you today.
Adaora, before we get started with some of the topics we wanted to cover today, just share a little bit about your background and your journey getting to the position where you are today.
Yeah. So I have spent my entire career in public service, really starting out in AmeriCorps decades ago. And it really put me on this path of being focused on servant leadership and trying to make our organizations that are in the public sector focus work as well as what happens in the private sector. So that has really driven the work that I've done, very focused on people development. People are the core of organizations, and it's really what I've built my entire career around, getting to know people, helping them to function better so that organizations function at their highest.
Well, we're glad to have you with us today and to learn a little bit more about the importance of learning strategy.
Excited to talk to you about it.
Absolutely. So to kick things off, Adaora, what do you think are some of the basics about organizational learning strategy that we should keep in mind?
Well, I think the most important thing when you go on this journey of developing a learning strategy is to have a really thoughtful about your mindset going in. I think oftentimes we approach the idea of creating a strategy as this easy thing. And the reality is that it takes a lot of iteration, a lot of time, a lot of listening, a lot of conversations. And that's even before you start putting pen to paper. And so really having a very clear mindset and setting clear expectations around what that process is going to look like is probably one of the most important things. Actually getting into the learning strategy, I would say the thing that is really helpful to understand around the basic structure of it is to think about it as a story. When I think about a learning strategy, I always think about it in terms of past, present, and future, right? And so the strategy should clearly articulate where you came from, where you are, and where you're going. And so within that structure, it's then a matter of just telling your story and backing it up with your evidence to prove why that strategy is important. That could look like data, quotes, or feedback. Really, it's anything to make that strategy matter to the people that it's going to impact.
Oh, absolutely. I think of the word intentionality when I think of a learning strategy and the impact that it can have across the entire organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when I think about impact, in order to understand how to make an impact, you have to understand who you are trying to impact. And so as human beings, we tend to gravitate, and even the way that we process the world, we have our own stories, our own movies, right, about the way that we are experiencing things. And so the more that you can think about how your strategy is structured as a timeline or a story, it starts to create that framework that's easy for your stakeholders to understand and follow. And ultimately, that framework gives you building blocks, and that building that strategy to develop people and to make the organization function more effectively, you have to actually make sure that it's understood. So by structuring it as a story, it helps people to kind of understand where we came from and what that vision is that we're all marching towards.
I would bet it not only helps the stakeholders, but it probably also helps the learners too, to know the strategy, the meaning, the why behind the learning.
Yeah, absolutely. Context is king is one of my favorite quotes. Think about that a lot when we think about strategy, because at the end of the day, I can write down all these wonderful ideas, but if I'm not including the people along that are actually going to help to make it happen or help to actualize it, it's just a really nice knob that doesn't do a whole lot for anyone.
I'd wager that this group is bought into a learning strategy. I don't think you need to convince us, but for someone who's maybe on the fence, like what are some challenges that we've seen can come from not having a clearly defined learning strategy?
Yeah, it's kind of scary to think about, at least in my line of work with what I've seen. But I think the biggest thing that comes to mind is just a lack of direction. And oftentimes that lack of direction leads to this kind of slow unraveling within the organization that I think we label it as culture, but that's really what it comes down to. Without the direction, you don't really have control over your culture and you start to lose hold of a lot of other things. The other piece of it too for me is I think about an organization as an ecosystem, right? And so in an ecosystem, organically find balance, but we have the benefit of being able to set some intentionality to it, to have that strategy. And if it doesn't exist, then the byproduct of the lack of strategy or direction can really have negative effects on the people in the organization. And ultimately, an organization is only as strong as its people. So if we're putting that learning strategy in place, it sets a mutual understanding and commitment to creating the best space and expectations for development in organization.
Yeah, that's a great answer. You can think of different areas of an organization going in different directions or marching to the beat of a different drummer.
Yeah.
And the inefficiencies that could occur.
Yeah. Organizations, one of the fun things for me whenever I go into an organization is if you ask one person what the culture is and then ask another, there'll always be different answers. And the reality is there are subcultures within organizations that exist. Every single division, every administration, every team within. It's just, for me, a lot of fun to figure out what those cultures and subcultures look like, because it starts to give you a really wide picture of what you need to address.
So on the other side of the coin, what are some benefits that could come from having a clearly defined learning strategy?
Logically, having direction is a benefit. But I think it's not just about the direction of the organization. I think about it more from having direction for your team, right? You have people that are responsible for actually executing the strategy. And the reality is that if you have a strategy, then you and your team know what the goal is. You know why it's important. You know how you're going to get there, ideally, if the strategy is well written. But the other piece, I think, the other benefit is it really helps to clarify priorities. Inevitably, you're going to set a strategy and you have to leave space to pivot, right? Because best laid plans, they're always going to experience some level of shift or upheaval. And so that's always, I tend to think about it in terms of percentage, like how much of our time is really going to be focused on executing the strategy. Am I reserving at least, 10 to 20% of my time to be able to pivot with the organization that I am here to serve? So but having really clear priorities in the strategy means that, let's say you get to the end of the fiscal year and there's this windfall of cash. It's like, oh, we didn't manage our grant as well as we thought we would, and we have all this extra money. What can we buy really quickly to help support? I can pull out my list of, okay, here are the things I wanted to do, but maybe we didn't have funding or we didn't have staff. And I can say, okay, number one is this. Can I get this, please? Or can I hire a new person? And so being able to have those really clearly listed out priorities of what needs to be addressed helps to kind of set the wheat from the chaff on what you want to focus in on.
Yeah, the power of an internal roadmap, right?
Exactly.
Got to have a positive impact on retention.
Yeah.
Employee experience as well.
Yeah. A strategy definitely helps the learning team that's responsible for executing it. But I also think about the fact that it's designed to support employee experience. And so from that perspective, having that learning strategy, it creates opportunities for employees too. So the outcomes of the strategy are ideally amazing and impactful learning opportunities that positively shape the employee experience and help to move the organization forward in a thoughtful way.
That's really great. All right. So now that we're all bought in and we're moving forward with the learning strategy in our organization, what are some questions we can ask internally to help set a strong direction?
I ask a lot of questions. The best things that I can ever say to someone who's new to an organization is you want to keep your mouth shut and your ears open, right? You just want to take it all in and kind of hear what's happening. But when I think about creating strategy in that same guise of like creating strategy as a story, I go back to my own writing days and I go back to the 5 W's and the 1 H. And it's really, not to say that your whole strategy should be, who, what, when, where, why, how, like you don't need to break it out that way.
And to what extent? Don't forget to.
And to what extent? That's right. Yeah. And so being able to kind of create that structure to start to guide my thinking and my research into this process, that usually shapes the conversations that I have, the questions that I ask, and ultimately how that information funnels into the final product.
Adaora, is that something our listeners should think about doing for every learning experience, or is it something that you set more on an annual basis? What kind of advice would you give for people to get started?
So I would say part of any learning strategy should have an evaluation component, being able to actually have a process for how you're going to evaluate impact for any initiative that's put forward. But I think going into it, you don't necessarily have to have all of these questions answered. I vary between it's good to plan, but you don't want to over plan, because then you get stuck in this loop of, oh, it's not perfect, I can't execute. And the reality is you have to be agile and you have to be able to just implement and try things. It's finding a balance. So maybe it is taking a few of these questions to kind of start to structure what you're implementing and start to evaluate. But I would definitely recommend, as a strategy is being put together, thinking about how you're going to evaluate the impact of your work. I mean, even when I think about these 5 Ws, it's always layered, or the 5 Ws and H, right? It's always layered with how am I asking these questions in relation to impact and return on investment for the organization? That's often a piece that's lost when we think about learning and development, because it's the warm and fuzzy side of people development, which is beautiful. And it's part of the reason I still do this after 2 decades. A lot of the conversations that I have with folks, especially, doing coaching or having conversations with executives, is I understand you want to do this, but how is it going to move us forward? Right. So being able to articulate that connection and alignment.
Absolutely. I mean, it's exciting to see out there the amount of adoption and prioritization for creating learning within organizations and sort of building out a strategy. But it does take time and effort. So what are some ways that we can gain buy-in if we have any skeptics within our team to move forward with a learning strategy?
Yeah, it definitely does take time. I think, I've shared a little bit about the time it takes to listen and being able to kind of make sure your strategies are a strong reflection of your stakeholders. But I would also say that comes along with just kind of managing your expectations and building a thick skin. This is organizational development, is change management too. Not everybody takes change the same way. Some people fight against it tooth and nail, which is their right, but you have to kind of anticipate and build your toolkit for that, to kind of hear people and validate their perspective and not be afraid to look them in the eye and hear what they have to say. I also find, especially the public space, oftentimes if you have folks who've been in public organizations or in government or nonprofits for a long time, they become a little jaded. And so rather than kind of shut that down or not take the perspective seriously, I dig in. I ask a lot of whys. Like, why are you feeling that way? Tell me more about what you're thinking. What's crossing your mind? Like, really helping to get to know that person and their experience, because the person that was in the room when you walked in who maybe didn't want to hear it will become your biggest advocate if they know that you're there to listen rather than to judge or just gather information and run away from them. So it's really about building partnership more than anything else. And that tends to be the way that I really think about buy-in. But I also think it's alignment. Right. So the approach of getting to know an employee and understand their perspective works to a certain extent. But if I go in front of senior leaders and say, I have a great idea, they're going to be like, that's great, but how does it benefit me? Why does this matter next to everything else? And so that is, I think, where alignment comes in as well. So being able to very clearly articulate, this is what I'm going to do, or this is what we're going to do. And this is how it directly connects to this organization's mission, needs, vision. And that really should be undeniably clear, so that this learning strategy is not just a series of trainings or opportunities for people to avoid their work, but rather these are opportunities for you to engage with folks, to strengthen your team, to help achieve your mission and vision, to meet your key performance indicators, which I know people dream about in government, but really helping people to see how you are on their team and how this strategy serves all of us.
Really liked your point about ROI as well. Like when we're asking questions and gathering data and we identify how we can get a return on investment, that can be a great point to emphasize when we're trying to get buy-in.
Yeah, it's always so easy to think about how it's going to make me personally feel. And if I go and do a training or a program or something like that, we have to be able to say, this is how it's going to benefit me, but this is how it's going to benefit you. It's teaching people how to brand and sell themselves, right?
That's right.
I would think too, with that ROI, you're able to then see really what's working to better define the learning strategy moving forward and really kind of build your department, in a more successful way.
Yeah, absolutely. Metrics are a key piece, a key next step once you have a strategy in place, is identifying what that impact looks like and how you're going to quantify it. So, I can tell you about all the wonderful conversations I've had with people when strategies are implemented, but it's going to come down to a number or a percentage, and you have to have some way to quantify it. So it's a next step, I think.
All right. So we're all on board. We're all bought in, and we've launched our internal learning initiatives that are aligned with our strategy. What are some tips for activating that learning once it's alive and available within the organization?
I love that word, activate. Let's get moving. It's a great way to put it, because that's really what it is. It's like, okay, we're all good. It's all written. Let's move. I think the strategy is the framework, right? And that the key part of the strategy that I often see overlooked or omitted in these like really pretty glossy learning strategies that are put forward is the implementation plan. How are we actually going to get this work done? It's a lot of ideas and not a lot of, okay, this is what we're going to do in Q1 or Q2 or this year. And so I think identifying those key actions first and foremost is really important, because it dictates your timeline. Once that plan is in place, the first piece is really, it's a roadshow. So I'm socializing the idea with people, I'm gaining buy-in, and I'm building excitement through communication and branding, right? I haven't even done the work yet. I'm just telling you what's going to happen so that when I come to you and say, hey, we're doing this great program, or we're talking about these new core competencies, they don't look at me like I have two heads and they don't know what I'm talking about. So I want to get people excited about this and help to see the potential for them personally in investing and participating in this opportunity. But once you get to work, that really means ensuring that everyone who has a hand in implementing the strategy has very clear understanding of the actions that they are involved and responsible for, not just their role, but also why it's important. That why is so crucial, because it's the thing that's going to keep that person moving and stop me as chief learning officer from chasing people down to be like, hey, did you forget about this thing that we're supposed to do and why it's important? So it helps to, you want that internal buy-in too, to the ideas that you're putting forward. It's a fun dance to get it activated. But I think once you've gotten started, it's just having your regular check-ins and cadence, and even communicating to the employees in the agency, we're going to continue to check in with you on how things are going so that this is visible and part of your day-to-day, so that you understand how we're flowing through it.
Yeah, great point. And within DaVinci and some of our clients, we've seen mentorship and peer-to-peer programs be a great way to reinforce and help everyone move forward.
Yeah, that collaborative learning is a lot of fun, and it's where learning happens. Honestly, there's so little that not little. It's not like it's not important, but there is so little that provides long-term gains from just a classroom session. It really comes down to how are you applying it? How are you learning about it? How are you learning from others? And so I love collaborative learning. That's where it's at. So.
So, Dora, you've got some amazing career experience. Could you share some examples of us with how you've used a learning strategy to create effective learning?
Yeah, absolutely. I've spent my career working to develop people to improve organizations in the public sector, and every single time it looks different. The most important thing is understanding the culture and the people you serve and you represent and you impact. Thinking about that in particular, there's one organization where, after taking time to gather perspectives, I identified the organization needed to focus first and primarily on the development of managers. Not to say that employees weren't important, but it was clear, given the size of the organization, we still needed to identify opportunities for employees, but the reality is that in a large organization, the biggest determinant of culture and work experience is the relationship that exists between an employee and their manager. The more that I could do to help influence that and kind of build up that toolkit for managers was really crucial. So managers needed to be able to have comfort and guidance in their people and leadership skills to supplement that technical expertise that got them into that role. Because oftentimes we see people who are rightfully promoted into management because they are good in the area that they work in. Doesn't necessarily mean we're good at the interpersonal stuff. And the reality is the interpersonal stuff is what gets things done. It's not just the technical expertise. to support managers, I implemented a training program. We supplemented it with collaborative communities of practice that helped to create a network for managers, broke down silos, because often as managers, I often find that managers feel the loneliest because they can't talk about a lot of the stuff that they're dealing with, but they deal with it and they know that others are. And so it helped to kind of break down silos between the multiple divisions in the organization and provided really practical experience and guidance from other peers in that space that managers could build on. It's one thing for me to say, oh, well, if you want to manage that performance, you write this plan and have this conversation, but to actually hear another manager say, this is what I did and this was my experience, that you talk about activating an idea, like that helped to managers to understand what it actually looked like, and even to get that feedback of, yeah, I was nervous. Yeah, I felt like I was going to throw up. Yeah, it was hard, but I did it and I'm here and here's how I got through it. That's really valuable to hear from someone who is in your role. A lot of work with managers in this particular organization, and that ultimately provided a foundation to support a coaching culture that we were building towards, right? So it wasn't, I'm a certified coach. I could sit down and coach thousands of people, but that's all I'd ever do, ever. And it doesn't work. So the reality is that as managers, you have to be able to shift into that coaching mentality as well to get the best out of the people that are trusting you with their careers. And so because of the work that we did with managers, we had that foundation to start to build a coaching culture in the organization that was actually put into practice with the implementation of an organization-wide 360-degree assessment program that filtered and structured our performance management process. So there are all these different pieces that just kept falling into place, but it all stemmed from managers. The change that we needed in the organization had so much to do, very little to do with me sitting in front of someone and training them. It had more to do with facilitating sharing of knowledge that already existed and building confidence and creating empowerment for those people who were leading the work in the organization. It all started with a strategy, the idea that we needed to create change, and how are we going to do that to create this learning culture that helped people to thrive in their roles.
Wow, what an amazing story. And think about the words alignment and strategy, and you just tell it so well, you can almost feel the employee morale lifting through the entire organization as you tell that story. That's amazing.
I haven't been in that organization for several years, and I still hear from a lot of people. It meant a lot to build those relationships with folks and be able to support them through that growth. The fact that you still hear from people years later in positive ways is always a good sign. So
that is a good sign.
Yeah.
Adaora, as we wrap things up, what kind of advice would you give to people either who are just starting to think about creating a learning strategy, or those who have one and really want to make it a deeper and broader tool to use?
Think about your why. That's probably the most important question or thing I can tell anyone to think about is, why are you doing this? What are you really trying to achieve? And let that be the guide for the decisions that you make. Having clarity around the impact that you're trying to create, and not even just impact, but the feeling, right? How do I want people to feel in this organization, and how am I going to get there? Because at the end of the day, this work, when we think about learning and development, talent development, OD, change, whatever you want to call it, it's about people. And people are human beings, and we have to think about what they need and how we can actually reach them where they are. So the why is really important.
Perfect advice. Thank you so much for joining us today, Adaora.
Thank you. This has been so much fun.
Thank you, Adaora. It's been great.
Mason, Adaora certainly laid out the reasons for a learning strategy. What are your takeaways from the conversation?
Well, she absolutely did. I think we made a clear and compelling case for getting started with a learning strategy, covering the basics, some of the challenges and benefits that can arise of adopting a clear organizational learning strategy. We also talked about how to gain buy-in and to activate our learning strategy once we have it established. So it was a great conversation.
And I'm sure that you've seen learning strategies work very well with the clients DaVinci works with. Talk a little bit about the importance of a learning strategy and how it helps with learner engagement as well as being successful overall for the business.
Yes, we always advise with our clients that when possible, it's worth the upfront investment to define and establish and roll out a strong and clear organizational learning strategy. So we've seen firsthand the benefits of this upfront. It guides the creation of the learning content and also the rollout and follow through within the organization. So it's a pretty compelling case.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Mason. And many thanks to our guest, Adaora Otiji, Chief Learning Officer with the Washington, D.C. Department of Health and President of the Metro D.C. chapter of ATD. If you have an idea for a topic or a guest, please reach out to us at poweredbylearning@davinci.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Powered by Learning wherever you listen to your podcasts.